This is the Cameron Journal Podcast. It's a place where we talk about important things. It's a place where we bring a little slice of the news to you. It's a place where we do important things, have important conversations. It's also things that I like to talk about. My name is Cameron Cowan, and this is the Cameron Journal Podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cameron Journal News Hour. So glad to be back with y'all. So sorry for last week. I had a terrible migraine. It was awful. I literally couldn't get out of bed. I'm not quite sure why my right side feels lower than my left side, or it's how I'm sitting, or whatever have you. Anyway, it's always a ongoing conversation. It looked fine when I was just doing an interview. Really great guy, business owner, and we were talking about systems and systemizing for businesses and all this type of thing. And so um it's a really great conversation that will come out in August. So that's extremely exciting, and there's been so much going on. I unfortunately, because I wasn't on last week, I missed the whole Trump indictment train, but we're going to talk about it today. Don't worry, I saved all my stuff. Um and I'll kind of give you my own unique ideas on that whole situation and what it all means for us, and we'll talk a little Ford Nixon too, and all that type of thing. I have a couple stories on AI coming up and all this sort of thing. So it's so good to be with you all. And it is so good to be able to, get back and feel good enough to be able to do this. I'm one of the biggest challenges over the last I would say 2 years, especially uh I've had COVID twice. One was asymptomatic, didn't hardly even know I had it, but I ended up with some fatigue. And I had just started to kind of get past that when I made the mistake of going to a graduation party, and we tested and we did all the things, still got COVID. Um, Happened very quickly. Um, and I lost all my ground on fatigue. And so and it's very difficult because I'm ramping up right now and doing all this. If you're following along with me on social media, I'm kind of doing all this great stuff, and really kind of moving in a bright new direction. And it's really hard when I kind of have a double barrel thing going right now, where I have a post COVID insomnia. I can't sleep. If I can get to sleep, I can't sleep longer than about 3 to 5 hours. And then I also have the fatigue thing, and it kind of creates this feedback loop of I feel tired because I can't sleep, and then because I'm not sleeping, I feel more tired, and it just kind of goes around and around and around. So, and I'm not a huge consumer of caffeine, all this type of thing, although I've started to be a little bit more. And I also know some of it is a bit of autistic burnout. Um, and and that is difficult as well. And it's sometimes hard to tell what's autistic burnout, what's the fatigue, what's the insomnia, all this type of thing. And I wish I were in a place where I could take several months off and do some healing and all this type of thing. In 2021, I was really busy writing books, and I took off from writing on the Cameron Journal about 6 months. And I didn't. I did a little bit of podcasting, um, and but I really didn't, write a lot for. I not all at once, but I took 3 months off in the summer, and then I took another couple kind of 1 month sessions throughout the year. It ended up being I took about 6 months off, and that's something I've contemplated doing that over this summer, but I don't think that's the right move. Um, I may take an extended break in the fall. We'll see. But it is definitely getting to the point where I feel like I do need to take a break and try to heal and kind of make that happen in a different way for myself. So I don't know what that's gonna look like yet. But um, I'm definitely feeling the effects. So anyone that tells you that long COVID isn't real or that it's BS or whatever have you, they lie. I am living proof. Long COVID is a thing. It is real. It does affect people. I am so fortunate that I do this where I can take a nap in the middle of the day, as I did today, as I have to do most days now. And for those that, have known me a long time or know me very well, I've never been a huge napper. I've never been one to nap in the middle of the day. I have been the king of the 12, 14, 16-hour day for years. I used to work all day and be in the gym 4 days a week and do powerlifting competitively and also work in nightlife. So I was literally up at 9, wouldn't get home till 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, would sleep for 5, 6 hours, get up, do it all over again. Um, and, uh, and so this is really out of character for me. So I know it is something different. It's something in myself that has changed. Um, and it's definitely a struggle. I know I've been reading on Twitter, although less so now than I used to. Um, People who have, I mean, I couldn't probably maintain a job right now. I will say, if I were still working in the 9 to 5 world, which I did for many years, it would, I would probably have to have quit or been fired by now, because I will hit 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then I'm done for 3 hours. I need to go lay down. I need to sleep, rest for at least an hour, sometimes three. Um, and and it's very difficult to operate on 5 hours of sleep at 35. Anyway, but then you pile on the fatigue symptoms and all this type of thing, and it's very difficult. And people have lost their careers over this. It is debilitating. It is disabling at some point. Um, and so it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing. So so last week was kind of nice. I wish it had been more restful than having a migraine. I had a migraine for 2 days, but it was nice to have a day off as well. So that was fun. Today is Juneteenth, our new federal holiday. 2 years now. We have Juneteenth, which is exciting. And it's a great new federal holiday, but not a new holiday to the black community. In 1866, they arrived in Galveston, Texas, to announce to black people in the western part of the Confederacy that slavery had indeed ended 3 years prior. And the Emancipation Proclamation had gone through, the North had won the war, and the peculiar institution was over. And so Juneteenth has been a day celebrated in the black community as a day of freedom and of joy and of light for many, many years, and now recognized at the federal level for the importance of it to a not insignificant part of our population, and to a not insignificant part of the American story. So I know it's a new thing. I know there's people still I've been on Twitter today. People are still complaining about it, and there's kind of this weird right wing narrative where it's like, real patriots don't celebrate Juneteenth, and or like we should be celebrating freedom for everyone, not just for a few. Um, and that is that's I could say so much. What should I say about that? It's naive. It's not reflective of where we are as a nation. It further reinforces this idea that black people shouldn't be anything special or celebrated in any sort of way and should just kind of, go off and do their own thing as, Americans and sort of conform to the white Anglo-Saxon standard, even though every time that has been tried, it has never worked. Every time black people have tried to become a part of American society, it has been rejected. Hi, Jim Crow. High sharecropping, high redlining, all this type of thing. Segregated military units till World War II. I mean, all of these things, there's been this kind of systematic repression all throughout. And so I think a day to celebrate and recognize that history, to give people a reason to talk about it every year, and to give us a chance to evaluate those systemic oppressive systems in our country today is a good thing. Um, Even though it's not an official day, we have a huge thing for St. Patrick's Day so that everybody can be Irish. So it seems to me that something like Juneteenth, especially as a real official holiday representing a halcyon moment in American history, and yes, it's American history for those of you keeping track at home, is a very important thing. It's just as important as President's Day or Memorial Day or Labor Day. Um, this is part of the American story, and it is it's really sad for me to see people reject that part of our history and that part of our story because they don't like it. It's inconvenient. It doesn't meet with their traditional values, which a lot of that is code. So much of it is code for white supremacy and whiteness and all this type of thing. It's not. It has nothing to do with anything laudable or something to be held in high regard, or is even inclusive of everyone. It's by its very nature, this language we use about freedom and patriots and all this type of thing is exclusionary because it goes along this idea that if you don't subscribe to this very narrow set of things, then you're not a real American, you're not a patriot, all this sort of thing. And that, one, doesn't truck very far with me, but two, it's just simply exclusionary. So, enough of that. I've gone on for too long, as I normally do. Let's get into the news. And I want to start off with inflation. Um, so, from the New York Times last week, we had this really handy article, and it says here cooler inflation bolsters argument for Fed rate pause. Consumer prices rose at slowest pace in more than 2 years, an encouraging sign for policymakers as they plot their next interest move. And so, as a nice chart here showing inflation over the last 50 years or so. And However, the chart is disingenuous because it excludes the most pricing volatile things, which is food and energy. Um, and I guess as an overlay with food and energy and without, and so we topped out at 8.5%, not quite as 1980-81 where we were up to 14%, a lot of inflation back then, or the late 70s where we were at 12%. And so we're headed back in a downwards trend to, by and large, where inflation has been over the 21st century, which hasn't really gotten any higher than about 5.5%. So, and it's always fun. You can kind of see the recessions and COVID in there. But it says here, Federal Reserve officials received an encouraging inflation report on Tuesday as price increases continued their months-long slowdown in May, news that could give policymakers comfort in pausing interest rate increases at their meeting this week. The Consumer Price Index climbed 4% in the year through May, slightly less than the 4.1% that economists had expected in the slowest pace in more than 2 years, though was notably cooler than in April when it climbed 4.9%. Inflation is down sharply from a peak of about 9% last summer, though it remains about twice as fast as was normal before the onset of the coronavirus pandemic in 2020. The fresh data offer the latest evidence that the Fed's push to control rapid price increases is beginning to work. Officials have raised rates at every one of their meetings starting from March 2022, making it more expensive to borrow money in hopes of slowing consumer demand, tamping down a strong labor market, and ultimately cooling rapid inflation. Now that they've made 10 straight rate increases, many officials have suggested in recent weeks that they could soon take a pause to assess how those adjustments are working. Investors have been betting that Fed officials will leave rates unchanged at their meeting, which they did, and the conviction that policymakers will skip a move this meeting deepened after Tuesday's report, helping to extend the recent rally in stocks. And ultimately, they chose to keep rates steady for now, and they're going to keep an eye on the situation and see how things go. They'll meet again in September. So, but it'll be interesting to see what some of the Federal Reserve Bank branches, what information they release. In the meantime, so inflation looks to be on its way down, which is nice. This next story is kind of an outlier, so we're just going to talk about it now before we get into Trump indictment and some other things. But J.P. Morgan settled last week with sexual abuse victims of Jeffrey Epstein. After weeks of embarrassing disclosures about the bank's long-standing relationship with him, the bank and lawyers for the victims said in a statement on Monday. David Boies, one of the lead lawyers for the victims, said the bank was prepared to pay $290 million to resolve the lawsuit. The parties initially had agreed not to disclose the settlement amount in their joint statement, as it was set to be included in a court filing within the next week. The proposed deal would settle a lawsuit filed last November in Manhattan federal court by an unidentified woman on behalf of victims who were sexually abused by Mr. Epstein over a roughly 15-year period when they were teenage girls and young women, the suit said. The number of victims could potentially rise to more than 100. In the statement, the bank and the lawyers for the victims said that they had reached, quote, an agreement in principle to settle, unquote, the lawsuit on behalf of the victims and that, quote, the settlement is in the best interest of all parties, especially the survivors who were victims of Epstein's terrible abuse. The settlement agreement was reached roughly 2 weeks after Jamie Dimon, J.P. Morgan's chief executive and one of Wall Street's best-known bankers, sat for a day-long deposition in which he said he had barely heard of Mr. Epstein before the financier's July 2019 arrest on federal sex trafficking charges. Mr. Epstein killed himself in August 2019 in a Manhattan jail cell. J.P. Morgan still faces a related lawsuit by the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands. That suit remains the biggest outstanding Epstein-related case after years of lawsuits against Mr. Epstein's estate and Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction in 2021 in Manhattan federal court for helping Mr. Epstein engage in sex trafficking. The lawsuit filed by the victims claimed that J.P. Morgan ignored repeated warnings that Mr. Epstein had been trafficking teenage girls and young women for sex, even after he registered as a sex offender and pleaded guilty to a 2008 Florida case to soliciting prostitution from a teenage girl. The complaint said the bank had overlooked red flags in Mr. Epstein's activity because it valued him as a wealthy client who had access to dozens of even wealthier people. Well, that sounds about right. But over at JP Morgan, $290 million, it's a lot of money, but it's not going to break the bank, as it were. Ha ha! Now, this next story I've been dying to talk about because it has a lot to do with the regulatory state. I just posted a video that will be out this week from Ari Velshi, who talks about this really important Supreme Court decision that has to do with the Clean Water Act. And this was from late May, so a couple weeks ago. It says here, the Supreme Court on Thursday curtailed the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to police millions of acres of wetlands, delivering another setback to the agency's ability to combat pollution. Writing for five justices, Justice Samuel Alito Jr. said that the Clean Water Act does not allow the agency to regulate discharges into wetlands near bodies of water unless they have a continuous surface connection to those waters. The decision was a second major blow to the EPA's authority and to the power of the administrative agencies generally. Last year, the court limited the EPA's power to address climate change under the Clean Air Act. Experts in environmental law said the decision would leave many wetlands subject to pollution without penalty, sharply undercutting the EPA's authority to protect them under the Clean Water Act. This is a really disastrous outcome for wetlands, which have become absolutely vital for biodiversity preservation and flood control, said Patrick Paranto, a professor at Vermont Law School. Kevin Manoli, who worked as a senior EPA lawyer from the Clinton to the Trump administrations, overseeing the enforcement of Clean Water Act regulations, said the decision would have enormous practical consequences and estimated that it would affect more than half the nation's wetlands. If you're in an area with a lot of wetlands, but those wetlands are not directly connected to a continuously flowing water body, then those wetlands are no longer protected by the Clean Water Act, he said. The decision was nominally unanimous, with all the justices agreeing that the homeowners who brought the case should not have been subject to the agency's oversight because the wetlands on their property were not subject to regulation in any event. But there was a sharp disagreement about a new test the majority established to determine which wetlands are covered by the law. Now, here's a bit of backstory on the homeowners. So, this case was brought to my attention by a video from Reason.com a couple months ago. And what had happened is this couple wanted to build their dream house on some land they had bought in an existing neighborhood. And the land, it already has roads, other houses, water, sewer, internet, the whole thing. It's an existing neighborhood. There happened to be a wet spot. I wouldn't even call it a wetland. I call it a marshy bit on the land. And they were going to fill it in and level it out and clean it up and maybe install a French drain or something. And done and dusted, that'll be the end of it. Well, the EPA decided that that was a protected wetland, and they could not build their house. No. That was a protected wetland, and so the EPA stopped them from constructing their house. And they, I think 4 years ago, started winding their way through the federal court system, suing the EPA to get the permission to finally build their house. And last week they finally won. And the downside being that in terms of what wetlands the EPA can and cannot protect, using the Clean Water Act as a guide is now more restricted. As somebody who has lived out west where we live in fear of the EPA and the Bureau of Land Management, I understand where a lot of people are coming from on this stuff. These people weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't trying to destroy a wetland. It was not a wetland. It was a marshy bit. If they were trying to build their house in the middle of a swamp, I might understand the EPA's story. But the reality is that this had no connection to another body of water. And the law, the Clean Water Act, is very clear on that. The EPA has used that to kind of extend its power as the decades have gone by. Same thing with the Clean Air Act. And so it's a difficult thing to balance between the needs of people, the needs of the environment, and how the regulatory state deals with that. And I think part of the problem is because it tends to be these really broad rules that get applied to everyone, there's no opportunity for context, there's no opportunity for nuance, and there's no opportunity to understand that this isn't a wetland. It's a marshy bit on somebody's land. No one is there. It's not a major migratory site for birds. There's no biodiversity is not being hurt. This is a wet bit on somebody's land in an existing neighborhood where they just wanted to build their house. And there were other houses already on the block. It wasn't like it was virgin ground getting tore up for somebody's vanity project. They wanted to build a modest house in a neighborhood. The land happened to have a marshy bit, and the big power of the EPA came in and tried to stop it. And this is where people get mad at the regulatory state. Now, I'm a big fan of regulations. I think regulations, by and large, are a good thing. But there are moments And I have this with vaping and what the FDA has done to the vaping industry, which is something I've written about for several years. Um, and you end up with these agencies that get a lot of power concentrated, and they end up doing things that adversely affect other people. And that is that is where you end up with these terrible lawsuits that unfortunately end up end up restricting things in not always positive ways. And this is a case where, yeah, I'm happy that the homeowners won because they deserve to build their house. At the same time, though, I also worry about what wetlands won't be protected because of this decision. I worry about you know, what areas where there might be migratory birds, where it might be a very useful wetland. What if those are not getting protected? And I think that is where we have to be more careful with how we regulate people, but most importantly, what's getting regulated where, and giving a chance for nuance and context. That's very important. And that always seems to be an issue, especially with these big regulations. So let's move on to a story about AI. This one I thought was rather interesting because the title got me. And it goes, "The AI revolution will change work. Nobody agrees how." The tally of how many jobs will be affected by world changing technology is different depending on who you ask. In 2013, researchers at Oxford University published a startling number about the future of work. 47% of all United States jobs, they estimated, were at risk of automation over some unspecified number of years, perhaps a decade or two. But a decade later, unemployment in the country is at a record low levels. The tsunami of grim headlines back then, like "the rich and their robots are about to make half the world's jobs disappear," look wildly off the mark. But the study's authors say they didn't actually mean to suggest that doomsday was near. Instead, they were trying to describe what technology was capable of. It was the first stab at what has become a long-running thought experiment, with think tanks, corporate research groups, and economists publishing paper after paper to pinpoint how much work is affected by or exposed to technology. In other words, if cost of the tools weren't a factor, and the only goal was to automate as much human labor as possible, how much work could technology take over? When the Oxford researchers Carl Benedict Frey and Michael A. Osborne were conducting a study, IBM Watson, a question-answering system powered by AI, had just shocked the world by winning Jeopardy! Test versions of autonomous vehicles were circling roads for the first time. Now, a new wave of studies follows the rise of tools that use generative AI. In March, Goldman Sachs estimated that the technology behind popular AI tools such as DALL-E and ChatGPT could automate the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs. Researchers at OpenAI, the maker of these tools, and the University of Pennsylvania, found that 80% of the U.S. workforce could see an effect on at least 10% of their tasks. "There's tremendous uncertainty," said David Autor, a professor of economics at MIT, who's been studying technological change in the labor market for more than 20 years, and people want to provide those answers. But what exactly does it mean to say that, for instance, the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs could be affected by AI? It depends, Mr. Autor said. Affected could mean made better, made worse, disappeared, or doubled. One complicating factor is that technology tends to automate tasks, not entire occupations. In 2016, for instance, the artificial intelligence pioneer Geoffrey Hinton considered new deep learning technology capable of reading medical images. He concluded that if you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff but hasn't yet looked down. He gave it 5 years, maybe 10, before algorithms would do better than humans. What he probably overlooked was that reading the images is just one of many tasks, 30 of them, according to the US government, that radiologists do. They also do things like confer with medical professionals and provide counseling. Today, some in the field worry about an impending shortage of radiologists, and Mr. Hinton has since become a vocal public critic of the same technology he helped create. And it goes on. I'm not going to finish reading the whole thing. Um, but I did find it entertaining, we'll say. That there was kind of this real divide among people of how AI is going to affect jobs and all this type of thing. I compare AI to the personal computer and the copy machine. The personal computer and the copy machine were the death of the typing pool. that eliminated a lot of jobs because it allowed people to do a lot more with less. Same thing with a lot of clerical stuff. Thanks to modern tools, professionals can manage their own calendar, send their own correspondence, all this type of thing. There used to be people who did that sort of thing. And slowly but surely, over time, those things were eliminated because technology made it easier and faster to do those things on your own. And it made it much more feasible to do those things without having to hire somebody and deal with all that overhead and all this type of thing. So it's a really terrible terrible thing. But I do conversely though, AI, much like the personal computer and the copy machine, is going to be like that, where there are some class of jobs that will probably be eliminated as those things take over and can do it cheaper, easier, faster, all this type of thing. But there's also another group of people that will be empowered to do more, faster, and more efficiently than they did in the past. And I think that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think, much like technology before, the profits, the results, and the efficiencies will not be evenly shared. They will not, a lot of people will get left behind. And unfortunately, that is what happens in these situations, is people get left behind. And regardless of what we think about AI or what we're going to do about AI, we need to focus on the people getting left behind. And hopefully we'll think about that this time around. Now, before we get into Trump indictment stuff, at the bottom of the hour, a couple Juneteenth related stories. One was from Bloomberg, was from today, and it said, corporate America struggles to deliver on $80 billion promise to diversify supply chains. Even as billions have been spent, it's been a challenge to get promises from the top of companies to translate into spending from the bottom. It says 3 years ago, corporate America pledged nearly $80 billion to diversify its supply chain by granting contracts to minority-owned businesses. But money spent hasn't necessarily translated into long-term success for those companies. Natalie King, the chief executive officer of Detroit-based manufacturer Dunamis Charge, is one of the beneficiaries of those efforts. Since 2020, the lawyer-turned clean energy entrepreneur has participated in Apple and carmaker Stellantis NV minority supplier programs, aimed at advising business owners on operations or how to gain new orders. She even met President Joe Biden when he presented at a White House event in March, but her company has yet to receive enough orders to scale her business. The lone assembly line at the company's factory is making about 400 electric vehicle charging stations a month for testing purposes, while the cavernous building that surrounds it is designed to eventually support 400,000 a year. We don't need pep talks, King said in an interview from her manufacturing site, less than a mile from where General Motors has its massive factory zero electric vehicle plant. We need substantive opportunities to grow our companies. What we hear is, you build it, all of it, then we'll see. It's difficult to measure progress. There isn't much data out there tracking these types of diversity initiatives. For its part, the Business Roundtable, made up of CEOs of many of the largest U.S. companies, including Amazon, PepsiCo, and Walmart, said its members have spent $33 billion since 2020 to support Black and Latino-owned small businesses, including suppliers, alongside additional billions to support lenders that focus on loans for minority supplier development. But according to interviews with suppliers, advocates, and business leaders, diversifying supply chains has been more difficult than anticipated, and with inflation, job cuts, and a possible recession, some worry the pressure to advance such efforts will abate. The $1 billion Roundtable, a two-decade-old consortium of 32 businesses focused on increasing business with minority suppliers, said in a 2022 report that expenditures jumped to $96 billion in 2021 from $76 billion in 2020. The group, which includes both Apple and Stellantis, has a combined $1.3 trillion in annual procurement spending, according to the report. The challenges are a myriad. In the months after the murder of George Floyd by police in 2020, America's largest companies pledged more than $300 billion to address racial inequality, including with suppliers. The Business Roundtable's report found some member companies lack effective means to track and implement programs, and some minority organizations are not equipped to absorb large capital investments and scale their operations in a short period of time. Other times, it's a matter of these smaller companies getting noticed in the first place. There isn't sufficient data on where suppliers are located, what sort of capacity they're able of, and how to link them up with companies such as the 3 million members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, said Rick Wade, the Chamber's Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach. There are also lots of gaps and overlap in terms of how suppliers are even designated as minority owned. The challenge is to actualize those investments. Some of that, I think, is connecting the dots. How do we make them more visible? And then it goes into how to make them more visible and how people have been successful and all this type of thing. And how to make this make this better, and getting Miss King's electric vehicle charger manufacturer up and running and making more vehicle chargers. So that also, bouncing from that in on the business side to California's new plan for reparations. And for those that don't know, California has a new task force to develop a financial rubric for how to pay out reparations for slavery. And the numbers add up to about 1.2 million, and the breakdown, which is the interesting part of this article, is as follows. The statistical value of each year of human life, accounting for racial differences in life expectancy, is $13,619. Wealth missing due to lower rates of black home ownership, $148,099. Average devaluation of black-owned businesses, $77,000. Each year of disproportionate incarceration factored by race, combining lost wages and freedom, $159,792. These calculations by California's task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, buried in the nearly 500-page draft of a report that will go to the state legislature in late June, belie the complexity and raw emotion underlying the first state-level effort to provide compensation for the legacy of slavery and discrimination in the U.S. By even considering reparations for harms that have compounded for centuries, California is transforming what has largely been a theoretical concept into a detailed model that may be adopted elsewhere as others also attempt to reckon with the cost of historical injustices. And at a potential cost of up to $800 billion, this would be to date the largest and one of the most complex reparations efforts in history. Some proposals are symbolic, such as an official apology from the state of California for the historic atrocities and harm suffered by black people. Others are familiar: greater investments in schools, healthcare, housing, job training, and businesses in black communities, improving access to higher education, advancing voting rights, and reforms in policing and public safety that gained renewed support after Floyd's murder by Minneapolis police officers. But none of the recommendations by the task force are more charged than offering direct compensation to eligible black residents who are descended from a person enslaved in the U.S. Depending on the harms claimed and how many years a potential recipient has lived in California, the loss calculations go as high as $1.2 million per person. In attempting to put a price on historical wrongs, California is forcing answers to questions that can't be derived with neat equations. Who will be compensated, and for what? Who pays the bill, and how will it be settled? And it goes on, it's quite an article. It goes on for a while about reparations and all this type of thing. I will say this, and then we got to do Trump indictment because we're coming up to the close of the show. I have never been a fan of reparations. I used to get in knockdown, drag-out arguments when I was in college as an undergrad, and I would say no. Handing people money is not the answer. It isn't. I think making the right investments in the community is 110% the answer. I think providing more grants for people to go to college, trade schools, buy tools, buy equipment for their business, start a business, 40 acres and a mule sort of thing, is a good idea. Just writing people checks is not going to work. I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's right, and it's unnecessary wealth redistribution. It just is. And I think it's hard to sell politically to people who are like, well, why are they getting money unnecessarily, and a lot of, the argument from a lot of my friends goes, well, why do we have to take responsibility for something we never did? No one who was responsible for slavery or who was enslaved is alive. Every one of them is dead. Um, and so for those, and I find those arguments compelling. I don't think reparations is the right solution. I don't think giving money to people is the right solution. I think actually improving the material conditions of African Americans in real and meaningful ways is the solution. Like the story we had from before with the black lady who owned the charging company. Why don't we give her a grant? Why don't we give her a government contract? Why don't we do things that actionably make her business better so that she can hire more people, so that she can grow her business? That's creating black wealth. What wouldn't do her any good is writing her a check for $1.2 million. Now, she doesn't live in California, so she's not eligible. She's out in Michigan. But, be that as it may, I've never been a fan of reparations. I don't think reparations will work. I don't think it really... It papers over the problem. Literally. It doesn't actually do anything to advance the material conditions of African Americans. And there's a lot of people who don't necessarily need that money as such, but they do need opportunity. They do need advancement. They do need a business loan. They do need a way to break out and create wealth for themselves. And I think that is a better way to move forward on this type of topic. And of course, it's Juneteenth, so we're talking about it, and California has taken this initiative. My one friend said jokingly, yes, California is planning on doing slave reparations, a state that never had slaves, per the Compromise of 1850, which is true. And I also look at, if we want to talk about reparations, let's talk about Japanese internment. A lot of Japanese farmers lost their farms in the Central Valley of California during World War II when we packed them up and took them away. And a lot of people never got their farms back because they couldn't pay the property taxes because they were taken away and warehoused in places like Arkansas during World War II, until the Supreme Court in 1944 said, no, you can't do that. And so it's... where's their compensation? That was a huge loss. It was a huge land grab by farmers in Central Valley, California. Huge land grab. A lot of people came back from Japanese internment and had to start their whole lives over with nothing. Again, when we start to get into all of this, we could spend the rest of the decade shuffling money about the country, paying people for this problem, this wrong, that wrong, all this type of thing. No. Let's improve the material conditions of people. Let's create systems where people do well and society does better too. This is the way forward. It's not just writing checks and pretending the whole problem's over. Let's fix the fundamental issue. All right. Now, speaking of fixing fundamental issues, let's talk Trump. So, I have a batch of articles here. The most important one, I think, is the one from Maggie Haberman, and it goes through exactly what's in the Trump indictment. So I'm sure by now you all have seen the pictures of Trump's document boxes in bathrooms, on a stage in a banquet hall, stored in a shower. In this article from Maggie Haberman, Glenn Thrush, Alan Furr, and Ben Protest, it says here, Mr. Trump and Mr. Nauta, who's a associate, Walt Nauta, personal aide, are accused of conspiring to obstruct justice. Prosecutors say they've assembled evidence showing that Mr. Trump willfully ignored a May 2022 subpoena requiring him to return everything belonging to the National Archives and took extraordinary steps to obstruct the FBI and grand jury. In the hours before Mr. Trump's lawyer visited his Mar-a-Lago estate to search for his documents in a storage room and attempt to comply with the subpoena, Mr. Trump directed Mr. Nauta, his co-defendant, to move 64 boxes out of the storage room because they maintained they were his property. I didn't want anybody looking through my boxes, I really don't, Mr. Trump told one of the lawyers according to the indictment. He stored boxes of important documents in the shower. The indictment says that in April 2021, Mr. Trump's employees needed to move dozens of boxes from a ballroom space they were converting to office space. There's still a little room in the shower where his other stuff is, one aide texted another. Soon after, the boxes were hauled into a small bathroom adjacent to a Mar-a-Lago banquet room and piled up neatly to the tiny chandelier next to the toilet. Top secret documents were stored so sloppily they spilled onto the floor. One of the most striking images in the document is a picture of a box of top secret national security documents that in 2021 had spilled on the floor of a Mar-a-Lago storage room, accessible to many of the resort's employees. The files were marked with restrictive Five Eyes classification markings, indicating that they could be only viewed by officials with top security clearances issued by the United States and its closest allies. Mr. Trump suggested his lawyer take a folder of documents, and if there's anything really bad in there, like, pluck it out. In one of the most problematic pieces of evidence for Mr. Trump, the indictment recounts how, according to his lawyer's words, Mr. Trump and the lawyer discussed what to do with a folder of 38 documents with classification markings. The lawyer said Mr. Trump made a plucking motion that implied, why don't you take them with you to your hotel room, and if there's anything really bad in there, pluck it out. This could indicate that he was holding on to sensitive documents, the bad ones, authorized people without appropriate security clearances to vet them, rather than simply returning everything to the archives as the government demanded. Mr. Trump shared secrets with visitors to Bedminster, and there's tapes. Many of the episodes recounted in the filing have been reported in the news media, including a potentially damaging revelation that he recorded showing off secret U.S. battle plans, describing the material as highly confidential and secret, while admitting it had not been declassified. See, as president, I could have declassified it, Mr. Trump said. He added, now I can't, but this is still a secret. A secret map was said to be shared with a political action committee staff member, and one of the other Mr. Trump's lawyers, Mr. Evan Corcoran, who worked for Mr. Trump at the time, is a key witness and will be testifying against Mr. Trump based upon what Mr. Trump asked him to do when he was in his employ. The other two stories are just as bad, and some of this other one, which is also Maggie Haberman piece, shows how Trump's actions were incredibly blatant. It says here, the indictment showcased the bedrock elements of the former president's personality: his sense of bombast and vengeance, his belief that everything he touches belongs to him, and his admiration of people for their underhanded craftiness and gamesmanship with the authorities. It recounts, for instance, how Mr. Trump had only praise for an unnamed aide to Hillary Clinton who, at least in his narration of the story, helped Mrs. Clinton destroy tens of thousands of emails from a private server. He did a great job, the indictment quotes Mr. Trump as telling one of his lawyers. Why? Because in Mr. Trump's account, the aide ensured that Mrs. Clinton didn't get in any trouble. The startling collection of covert material referred to in the indictment included documents about U.S. domestic nuclear programs, potential vulnerabilities to an attack on the homeland, and plans for retaliatory strikes on foreign adversaries. In the bluntest language possible, the indictment explained just how dangerous this was. Quote, the unauthorized disclosure of these classified documents could put at risk the national security of the United States, foreign relations, the safety of the United States military, and human sources, and continued viability of sensitive intelligence collection methods. Though the strength of Mr. Smith's case will ultimately be tested by Mr. Trump's lawyers, the evidence that the special counsel and his team assembled was abundant and varied. The indictment included photographs, a transcript and recording of Mr. Trump, and of course the lawyer's notes, which were obtained through a highly unusual legal tactic of working around attorney-client privilege. All of this, taken together, offered an intimate glimpse into Mr. Trump's world at Mar-a-Lago, a domain where he apparently enforced a sense of personal control. In one anecdote in the indictment, 2 employees of Mar-a-Lago are described exchanging text messages about Mr. Trump asking Walt Nauta, one of his close aides, to move boxes of government records out of a business center at the property so that the other workers could use it as an office. Mr. Nauta was charged with conspiring with Mr. Trump to obstruct justice in the case. Okay, the indictment quotes one of the employees writing to the other, so POTUS specifically asked Walt for those boxes to be in the business center because they're his papers. In a similar fashion, the indictment describes Mr. Trump as seeking to stonewall both prosecutors who issued a subpoena to him for all the classified material he had, and the lawyer, Evan Corcoran, whom he had hired specifically to help him comply with that subpoena. I don't want anyone looking through my boxes. I really don't, it quotes Mr. Trump as telling Mr. Corcoran. I don't want you looking through my boxes. The indictment did not merely accuse Mr. Trump of holding on to all these files, it also noted that on at least 2 occasions he showed, or came close to showing, classified material to others who lacked the proper security clearances to view them. And this gets into, in my mind, what the issue has been with this all along. When it came out that he had retained all these documents, a pallet full, that they had brought from the White House in the final days when they were leaving in 2021, I said, well, Trump is a grifter. What would a grifter do? He would sell the information. I firmly believe that he is at minimum using it as a parlor trick for friends. Oh, look at, oh, here's the documents about the new nuclear missile we're building, and look, I have it here, and here we are. And I also firmly believe that given his connections to Russia, his connections to the Middle East, through his son Jared Kushner, all this type of thing, these documents are for sale to the highest bidder. Minus the fact, if you're a foreign intelligence agency, like Russia, let's say, just get an agent to get a job at Mar-a-Lago, and you could start grabbing that stuff, or at least taking pictures of it and forwarding it back to Moscow. Like, there's so many opportunities for this intelligence to start leaking out into the world. The nature of it being unsecured is incredibly dangerous. Now, bearing that in mind, there's another kind of odd aspect to this whole classified documents thing that's very difficult. And it goes like this. We know Hillary Clinton had an email problem. Joe Biden has boxes of documents in his garage. Mike Pence had documents. Apparently, if you've been in the White House, they just kind of grab shit on their way out the door. I say we need to shake down the Obamas and the Bushes and see what they have. Shake down Jimmy Carter if you have to. And there's the lack of standardization and clear rules on this is very difficult. So one of the things I went and researched early on in this whole thing was to figuring out how the classification process works, who controls it, how is it standardized. I was shocked to find out it's not. In the National Security Act of 1947, the original classification authority lies with both the president and the vice president and those whom they designate. That's it. It never specifies how the rest of this process is supposed to work, which I think is really odd. It seems to me that this should be standardized and laid out. I mean, when low-level people, are caught with a classified document, or they go to prison, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go straight to jail, that's it. Edward Snowden will never return to the United States because of what he did with leaking classified information. This is how this has gone on. And so, but apparently when you get to the upper levels of government, the rules change. Now, some of that's politics. Hi, Hillary. But a lot of it is just a lack of standardization. And that, I think it's very difficult to charge Trump for this, because if you're going to hold him to that standard, which apparently is not just the taking of the documents, but the lack of returning the documents, then you would need to be going after Mike Pence too. You need to be going after, Joe Biden too, for having them in his garage. I mean, the lack of standardization in all of this, and the lack of clear boundaries of this stuff doesn't leave even if you are the original classification authority, all this type of thing needs to be laid down in law. And I think the one thing that I find interesting is that when you start to dig into how all of this stuff works, it gets really convoluted once you get above a certain level. And I think, again, this is one of those things where Donald Trump has done a great job of exposing every hole in our system where we relied on the goodness of the office holder, on a general acceptability of norms, an acceptability of democracy, all of these types of things to keep things going. We've relied on that for far too long. And so Trump's the type of person, if it doesn't explicitly say you can't do it, then you can. And so he's the type of person that if you have a hole in your system, he will find it. If you have a gap where he thinks he can get through and get an advantage, he will take it. He's one of those. They exist everywhere. You've seen them in your life. And this is another case of that. Do I think Trump is going to jail? No. Do I think anything's going to meaningfully come of this? No. But it is another case of Trump using his office and the federal government and information that is owned and controlled by our federal government, the one that we, the people, control, for his own personal gain. And that is the worst part, by far. By far, by far. All right. It's the top of the hour. I monologued a lot. We covered a lot of news stories, caught up from last week. I'm sure we're going to be talking about the Trump indictment more as things go to trial and all this type of thing. So, look forward to that. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next week for the Cameron Journal News Hour. Bye bye now. That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter. And we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.